Well, hello and thank you for coming. My name is Robert Mays. I'm a near-death experience researcher. We live here, Suzanne and I live here in Chapel Hill, and I serve on the board of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And we have been doing research for the last 11 years on near-death experiences and consciousness. And our talk here is, the main objective of our work right now is to demonstrate the reality of the independent autonomous mind in ordinary consciousness. But our basis for this work is near-death experiences. And today we want to share some interesting information that we've developed looking at two important items of experimental evidence. And our topic is specifically about memory, the mystery of memory, and understanding that through near-death experiences. So let's discuss what memory is to begin with. We distinguish three main types of memory, and this is somewhat different in some respects from the standard view of memory in neuroscience. First of all, let's look at this diagram of the brain. This is a picture of the brain that is, if you cut your head, your skull, horizontally this way, take the skull off, cut the brain at the brainstem, and lift out your brain and hold it in your hand like this, and look at it, then you would be seeing this view, which is the bottom of the brain. And it has a number of structures that we're interested in. In particular, there are these two pink structures, which are the hippocampi, structures that are on the medial temporal lobe. This is the temporal lobe, that would be on the right side, and this is on the left side. And on the inside medial surface, lower medial surface, is the hippocampus. And these are the frontal lobes, as I mentioned, the temporal lobes, and at the bottom here we have the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. And all of these structures, in our view, are important for memory. So the first type of memory is episodic memory. This is memory that you have of experienced events. And there's strong evidence that this is connected with hippocampus. Memories of specific events, experienced events in your life. For example, you were in high school trigonometry class in grade 10, and Miss Baldwin was the teacher, and she drew on the board a diagram of a triangle, and she said, and she marked it in a certain way, that this is an isosceles triangle. And you remember that lesson. You remember her drawing that. That is your episodic memory of that event. And you remember that she mentioned isosceles triangle. Now, and you can remember that today, 20 years later, 50 years later, whatever. But you also know what an isosceles triangle is. And you learned what an isosceles triangle is as semantic knowledge from that lesson. And then probably the test afterwards, and using it in proofs afterwards, and so on. In other words, as you recalled that particular type of triangle with equal sides, isosceles triangle, you learned that as a fact. And you now know the meaning of isosceles. And those are examples of semantic knowledge. And neuroscience calls this semantic memory, but we feel that it really is knowledge. And it is abstractions and facts that you've learned, facts of personal experience. Like, I graduated high school in such and such a year, my birthday is such, and so on. And it's also experiences that you've had in the world, and they are all derived, if you think about it, all of our semantic knowledge is derived from episodic events. We have an experience and we learn something. And then the third type is pattern memory, which is patterns of movement actually all kinds of patterns of movement, patterns of speech, habits that you've developed. And for animals, we believe also that they have a kind of pattern memory which we call instincts. Instinctual behavior patterns. And of course, we have patterns of behavior as well, but they are not usually instinctual. We are not born with them, we have to learn them. There's also working memory, and working memory is sometimes called short-term memory as opposed to these other kinds of memory which are more long-term, but neuroscience is trying to get away from that terminology and calling it working memory. This is what you can hold in your mind for maybe up to 30 seconds. And if you can hold it in your mind for 30 seconds and you have episodic memory, then you can hold it in your mind further as episodic memory. And two of the mysteries of memory are where and how is memory formed, and where is it stored, where is it located. And the conventional view for at least episodic memory is that it is formed by what they call long-term potentiation, which involves the strengthening of neural connections in the hippocampus. So in here, there are connections that are formed as you have an episode of an event in your life, and it changes the neural connections on a long-term basis. And then, by the conventional view, it's stored there in the hippocampus, and it is recalled again from the hippocampus. There was a patient who died recently. He was known in the literature as HM. His name was Henry Molaison. In 1953, he was suffering all his childhood with severe epilepsy. In 1953, Dr. William Scoville had the brilliant idea to remove both hippocampi to alleviate his epilepsy. And it did. It helped his epilepsy a lot. Unfortunately, after that, he was unable to form and recall episodic memories. And in fact, if you look carefully at the examinations that they did of him back in the 50s and through the 90s, actually into the 2000s, he could not recall any episodic memories, specific episodes in his life even before. He had what we would call semantic knowledge of those events in his life. But to remember a specific camping trip that he had been on with his parents, but he had what we would call semantic knowledge. And so that's where we get the evidence, and there were several other patients of this sort who didn't have the surgery specifically, but had damage to both hippocampi and had this inability to form episodic memories. Now, because of the lack of episodic memory, he was not able to form new semantic knowledge very easily. There are exceptional examples in his life where he was able, for example, he learned and knew of the assassination of JFK, the president who was tragically assassinated. He knew that there was a thing flying above the Earth called the Skylab because he was very interested in aviation and space. And he remembered who Edith was, Edith Bunker, and Archie, and Meathead. So he had developed memories that he could recall, but he couldn't recall specific. But when he learned that, and we feel that they were because of there was repetition, and it was emotionally charged. Of course, the assassination of the president, actually that was the first in our lifetimes, assassination of a president. So that was emotional, and Skylab was emotional because of his interest, and Archie Bunker was emotional because it was a great show, All in the Family. And he had repetition, I'm sure, of those events. But he had semantic knowledge. He was able to keep all of the words, his vocabulary. He did crossword puzzles all the time. So he had semantic knowledge. He could speak very well, but he couldn't remember anybody. So he would, you come in, introduce yourself, and you have a little chat, and he looks away, he's distracted, and he doesn't know you anymore. In other words, after 30 seconds, his working memory is wiped clean if he's distracted, and that's what happened. But he had the working memory, so he was able to keep things in mind, as we all can. He also had pattern memory. He retained all of his skills. He could learn new patterns, new skills, and there was a thing called priming, which we won't get into. So that is memory. Now, talk about the mystery of near-death experiences. So, briefly, a near-death experience is a profound psychological event where someone comes near to death or has extreme emotional or physical distress, psychological distress, and there's this experience, profound experience. The striking elements: feeling separated from the body, being aware of things going on elsewhere, having scenes of one's past life. These are only some of the key elements in the NDE scale. Entering some other unearthly world, seeing deceased relatives or religious figures, encountering a mystical presence or a brilliant light. And you've heard those described here already. The striking phenomenological aspects for us are that there are these apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, AVPs. Veridical means that they are accurate and verified. They're perceptions of the physical environment, and they were during coma or cardiac arrest, or when the NDEr could not have physically seen them or perceived them, even if it was auditory. So it was down the hall, or it was in another city, or they were totally in a coma, they had had a cardiac arrest, and while they were being attempted to be resuscitated, they had these perceptions and they were accurate. Other things is that they are hyper-real, more real than real, more real than this. And for us, particularly for this talk, memories are indelible. Compared to other memories, episodic memories, they appear to be episodic memories because, this is what happened and this is what I experienced, but those don't go away. Whereas most episodic memories fade. And when they are recalled, the NDEr seems to relive them. And I have some smiles from NDErs in the back there. They seem to relive them. In other words, they are right there in their mind. And that transports them in a way, and maybe even into an altered state of consciousness. And then there are these numerous after effects. In particular, most NDErs feel that their experience was the most significant event of their life. And I want to briefly, I'm going to skip over the details of this, but there is a new book coming out on paranormal aspects of NDEs. It's called The Self Does Not Die. Suzanne and I have been intimately involved with a translation of this from Dutch. It was originally published in 2013. It will be coming out in 2016 in July at the IANS conference, and it will be available on Amazon. It documents 104 verified cases of veridical perceptions and other paranormal phenomena from NDEs. And the authors, these three authors, Titus Rivas, Annie Dervin, and Rudolf Schmidt, took only independent third-party verified cases. In this new edition, they and Suzanne and I and a number of other people assembled 26 new cases, so now there's a total of 104. And many of them are very recent reports. And Jan Holden, who is IANS is doing the publication. Jan Holden is the editor of our journal and is also the editor of this book. And Suzanne and I have written the foreword. I won't go into the details of all of these cases, but I just want to say that there are the 2/3 of the book are these cases of apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, AVPs. And you can see, and they have 3 types. And I won't go through the details of that. If you know the cases of Al Sullivan, Maria Shu, 1985 quarter seen on a shelf, or a 12-digit serial number of a medical device where you had to climb on a ladder to find it, that kind of perception. Lloyd Rudy's patient who was dead for 20 minutes and saw things that while his heart was just beginning to start again. And Lauren Belge has this book, Near Death in the ICU, which we highly recommend, and a number of her cases in there. And those were the AVPs. These are the other things. Telepathic communication, George Rodinaya, for example, communication with unknown deceased persons, Colton Burpo's Heaven is for Real case. You know a deceased person, but you didn't know that they had died. And there are 6 cases of those. Eddie Cuomo is a good one. And the cases of apparitional NDEs, where the NDEr, during their NDE, travels to another location to visit someone and reports back that they visited them, and the people there, or the person there, saw the person and reports that they saw the person, and there was something communicated, and that's also verified. Very interesting cases showing the objective validity of these reports. And miraculous healings, Neil Morjani, and psychic abilities after an NDE, Cheryl Lee Black, who has been here and studied here, and Tom Sawyer made a prediction which came true and was documented and verified. Okay, so what's going on in NDEs? There are 2 opposing explanatory hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that brain activity produces these effects. And there are 2 kinds of explanations. Well, it was imagined or constructed either before or after the period of unconsciousness. They have a cardiac arrest. Well, as they're going down, they imagine something, and as they're coming back, they imagine something, or they hear certain things, and they construct what happened. And then the other is that there was hypoxia and lack of oxygen, or endorphins, or neurotransmitters that produced hallucinations of meeting deceased relatives and so on. The other hypothesis is that the consciousness or mind of the person separates from the body. So the mind in ordinary consciousness is united with the body fully, and then with the NDE separates, and then after their NDE they come back, but they've changed because their energetic field has changed, and there are these after effects with electronics and sensitivities and so on. So now we're going to, that's introductory, so now we're going to go on to looking at memories and the special nature of memories of NDEs. And this is one of the studies that we want to look at. There was a study by Marie Tonard and Stephen Loris and colleagues in the University of Liège, and they compared NDEr memories with people who are in coma without an NDE, and they compared real and imagined events versus the NDE memory. And they had a measurement tool called the Memory Characteristics Questionnaire, which measured how many sensory details they were able to report, how much the NDErs mentally relived the event, and how much they remembered being involved in the event, and how much the NDEr felt the emotions of the event. And that's for the NDEr plus also real events, remembered events that were real, and remembered events that were imagined. And they found significantly more characteristics in the NDErs. The NDErs were extremely high in emotional content. They were more vivid and real to the NDEr than even the real event that the NDEr was asked to remember. And they remembered being more involved in the event than the non-NDErs. I'm sorry, and that's compared with the imaginary. So they concluded that NDEs can't be considered as imagined events. They're totally different from imagined events. And they concluded that the NDE events were really perceived. And this contradicts the skeptic's assertion that their NDEs are dreamlike memories or altered memories of real events. And they remembered that they were actively involved and the events were really perceived. That's the conclusion of the researchers. And that shows that the AVPs, the apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, were actual perceptions, not imaginations or confabulations. And the researchers said what makes the NDEs unique is the perception of the experience itself. And there was a second study which had a couple of objectives. First of all, they wanted to repeat, this was just the next year, repeat the Tonard et al. Study using the MCQ. And they found the same results. NDE members had greater detail, richness, complexity, and so on. And there was no significant difference between the NDEs and real memories. They had the same amount of detail. But they did two other things. They had two enhancements. First of all, they used hypnosis-based clinical protocol to improve the recall. And they did that for all the subjects. So that would increase the recall, improve the recall, and increase accuracy. And they also did EEG recording to investigate the neural markers of NDE memories versus real and imagined memories. And this is how they did the EEGs. They recorded an 8-minute period of recall of the imagined memory, the real memory, and the NDE memory. And they had controls that did real memories and imagined memories. And they had the NDErs do their NDE memory, which you might think is like an imagined memory, and a real memory. And during the hypnosis, they had an 8-minute period where they were to recall the memory, the given memory that they were testing. And then they did the MCQ score before the hypnosis EEG and after the hypnosis EEG, and that gave them a measurement of improvement in memory recall, which we call delta MCQ. So here's the effect of hypnosis. Of course, they found an increase in MCQ scores for all the experimental conditions, which is what you'd expect. You hypnotize somebody and ask them to remember something, they will remember more details and so on. But the increase for the MCQ score was significantly higher for NDEs and real memory recall than for imagined memories, which is a further confirmation that NDEs are not imagined events. But there's more. The EEG results found, and this is what really piqued our interest, was that the NDE memories, well, for when the NDE memories were more strongly recalled, because they had a number of subjects, they could say, well, this NDEr, their score increased by 2 points. This NDEr score increased by 5 points. Well, the greater that increase in memory recall, the more power was recorded in the frontal and temporal lobes in the delta band and theta band. These are low frequency bands. And those were not present in the recall of real memories. So there's a difference between NDE memories and real memories with the EEG. And the second one was that when they had strongly recalled real memories under hypnosis, then there was a greater power in the central and temporal regions, and the gamma, very high frequency, not present in the NDE memories. And so there's a qualitative difference in the way memories appear in the brain when they are recalled. And we feel that that's important. In fact, that is the basis of our model. So they give clues to how memory works with the brain. Now, this is like a summary of the comparison. So, NDE memories are different. The experience is hyperreal. The memories are indelible, long-lasting. When they're remembered, they're relived. And the NDE memories are really perceived, and the NDEr remembers being actively involved in the event. And there's this EEG difference or brain difference that NDE memory recall is low frequency in the frontal and temporal lobes, and real memories are high frequency in central and temporal lobes. So we want to consider how the mind-entity hypothesis can explain these facts. So what is the mind-entity hypothesis? It means that the mind can separate as an energetic, non-material entity from the physical body. It is present in ordinary consciousness, but it can separate. And it is the seat of your subjective phenomenal experience. In ordinary consciousness, the mind interfaces directly with physical processes in the brain, and that's possible because evidence from NDEs shows that there is physical interaction with this non-material energetic entity, with light, sound, and solid objects, and there are other NDE phenomena. Okay. So, this view holds that the brain is a sophisticated mechanism used by the mind. So let me say that again. The brain is a machine, the body is a machine that's used by the mind. The mind and brain have a closely coupled interface. The mind is embodied in the brain and body. And this is very much like if you have a car and you love to drive and you get used to driving your car, you become embodied in your car. And some drivers feel this. They feel that, oh, wow, the car is me. I know exactly where the car is all around me, and I can feel how it's running, and I can control it with my hands and feet. That's an embodiment. Well, the mind is embodied in the brain just that way. That intimately, much more intimately, actually. So there's this symbiotic relationship with the brain, and you can look at it as the brain is the extension of the mind. Just like the car is the extension of the driver in the car. And you experience the world and you interact with the world only through your brain. So conscious experiences are always a reflection of brain activity. Unless you're psychic, which most people are not, all the consciousness that you have is through your brain. If there's brain activity, then you can be conscious. But if your brain is impaired in some way, then you are less clearly conscious or unconscious. And how this works is that there are these neurocortical regions. So there are these different areas of the brain. These are the Brodmann areas of the brain, which are based on different cell structures, and they are roughly connected with functions. So this is the speech understanding area. This here is the speech formation area. You have a motor area up here. You have somatosensory area. You have your executive functions here, and you have your visual functions back here. And your recognition of things and memory are in your temporal lobes. Okay, so they are all functional areas. And the mind then has to be interfacing differently because things are going on differently in different parts of the brain. And so the visual areas, there's an interface with the mind that's different than in the motor areas. The mind is receiving perceptions somehow or other through the visual areas and is inducing movements through the motor areas and making decisions through the executive areas. So all of these areas, the mind has to have a different connection. And in general, all cognitive functions come to awareness in the mind. And in particular, all memory content is located in the mind. Memory content is in the mind. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but just to say that this works at the very lowest levels. We feel that there's an interface with the apical dendrites in certain layers of the cortex, and that this works at a functional column level, which is like a half a millimeter wide differentiation of your brain. This is a particular picture of the functional columns on the cortical surface, visual cortical surface, where this part of the brain distinguishes the orientation of lines in the visual field. So red ones are oriented towards, and they're color-coded given how they detected this differentiation. But this is a roughly 3 by 3 millimeter square. So all of the red areas detect vertical, and the dark blue slightly off of vertical, and horizontal would be the green, and so on. So it's at that level that the mind is interfacing, and through the gray matter of the cortex. And the second point is that the neurons fire action potentials. In other words, they receive inputs and then they cause their own firing, where there's an increase in electrical potential all of a sudden, and they're quiet for a little bit of time, and then they can do it again, depending upon their inputs. So that neural firing happens, but all of the action potentials have the same amplitude or power, and so therefore, to get more power, you either have to have higher frequency, which sometimes occurs, or you have to have many more neurons firing together in the same brain region to have more power. And one of the implications of this action potential is that brain functions must operate through time. And there is a law where it was confirmed, experiments by Benjamin Libet, that conscious awareness does not come instantly, but conscious awareness only comes after a certain amount of brain electrical activity of a sufficient power sustained over a sufficiently long time. And if you went to minimum stimulation levels, you would need a half a second to come to consciousness. So you have a very mild stimulation on your skin such that you don't feel it at all. And then they up it a little bit and it becomes liminal, and then it takes a half a second to feel it. And this Libet called the time-on principle. And it applies in his proposal to all electrical activity in the brain. But in our view, the mind is engaged throughout this process of coming to awareness, and the awareness remains subliminal until it becomes fully conscious. And therefore, the mind is tied to time, and the brain provides resistance to the mind. The mind can act instantaneously, at least in the out-of-body case, but it cannot act that instantaneously in ordinary consciousness, because the brain is there. All right. Now, this brings up another significant phenomenon that will relate to memory. It's a phenomenon that's called the speed of sight, which was developed by Simon Thorpe, discovered by him, University of Toulouse, and he did a series of experiments measuring the ability to do ultra-rapid visual categorization. And so you'll see how this ties into memory, and also to NDEs. So he would show a natural scene with or without an animal. It's flashed for 20 milliseconds. The subject can correctly, that is to say 94% of the time, say that the photo contains an animal or it doesn't. And it's a very robust phenomenon because they've done it with animals, with faces, with cars, etc. The images, you can see them here. Here's some faces, inverted or right side up, animals, distractors. Here's some more distractors, upside down, and here are some humans versus animals, and so on. And it's limited to coarse visual representation. You can't get the details in that short a time, but you can see it. And the subjects report that they perceive a fully segmented scene in which the relations of all the objects in the image are clear. Now I'd like to give you a sample of this to get a feeling for this phenomenon. So we have put together a slideshow, a very carefully timed slideshow, but we did not do this with a great deal of care with respect to selecting exactly the right kinds of images of animals or no animals. And the precision of the timing has to do with the precision of the hardware that we're doing here, so we can't be exactly sure how long these times are, but this seems to be what happens. So if you want to do this, it doesn't take very long. You can get out a piece of paper, and you'll write an A for animal and N for no animal. And you will see a dark screen for 5 seconds, and then there will be a plus sign, which means focus, because in the next second there will be the picture, like that. And then there will be a blank screen for 5 seconds where you can write down as quickly as possible whether it was an A or an N. And it goes on to the next test. So you're ready to go if you want to do this? Here we go. Okay. Plus animal and no animal. Plus animal and no animal. Plus animal and no animal. Hang on, I'll let you watch. So here are the answers. But you can get a sense of what the experience is. Animal, animal, no, no, animal, no, no, animal, animal, no. Okay, so you get a feeling for it. Now here's another example. This goes faster. People are going to be speakers at the IANS conference. You could recognize some of these, I hope. Jeff Olson. Lauren Belch. Maggie Callahan. Whoop, 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 whoop. Oops. Okay. All right. So now, what's going on? So, and this is going to get into EEG, but it's very interesting, and it gives us an insight, I think, into the non-material aspects of the mind. So, when you have any stimulus, there's what they call an evoked potential, an initial blip that occurs in the EEG. And it happens that when these pictures are shown for 20 milliseconds, there is an evoked potential. You would expect it to be back here where the visual cortex is. Yes, you get it there, but you actually get it all over the brain. Very interesting. So, and actually I don't think anybody really expected that. And then after that initial potential, there's a follow-on of the processing of that. And in this case, the processing is, this blip here is called a P1 or P100. That's evoked potential. It's not very large, but this is what is typically happening in the brain. And then there is a reduction in the potential, and this is being measured by electrodes that are on the scalp. So it's hundreds of thousands of neurons are being measured here. So they go slightly positive, and then they drop down in negative. That's the N100. And then they go up positive. That's the P200. And then there's an N200 and an P300. And so on. And so this is characteristic. And this dark line is the characteristic line, is the mean of 15 subjects when they detected the animal. And they were right. Okay. By the way, how many people got a lot of the answers, or some of them, most of them? Yeah, that's normal. That's the typical 89 to 97% that they see. So, when you get it right, for 15 subjects, the mean in the frontal lobes, now, in the frontal lobes, the mean goes like this. And it's similar in the other lobes, but there is a difference here. And that is, this gray line is the line of no animals, and that was correct. There's no animal, that's the correct. And then if you take this line and subtract one from the other, you get this difference. And what they found was, in the frontal lobes, and this is in the front part of the brain, you start to get this difference showing up. Well, that's not where it's supposed to show up. It's supposed to show up in the visual cortex, or at least the parietal lobes, because the idea of vision is that it starts here and it gets processed in what they call the dorsal path, and then it gets processed in the ventral path below into the temporal lobes, but not in the frontal lobe. But that's where they first see this difference. And they plotted the difference of one subject. So this is one subject's experience in one of the tests. And you notice that that's where the difference shows up in the frontal lobe. Actually, right here, what we call the medial frontal lobes. And that's where the difference is detected of the meaning, the recognition that there's an animal there or there isn't an animal there. And that happens so quickly, 150 milliseconds. Now what this plot here is saying is that this is plotting just the difference. All right, so there's no difference. There's a lot of activity going on everywhere, but there's no difference in terms of what they recognize. And where there's a difference between the animal and no animal cases, it starts here, it gets really strong, and for this subject it got weaker and weaker and then got stronger again, and then it started moving. And after 200 milliseconds, it was down here where you would expect there to be some more visual processing, and then into the left temporal lobe where you'd expect there to be some recognition. And this is all less than 4/10 of a second. And that's what's going on in your brains also. And this said that to us that there is something really strange going on, and nobody's talked about this since this one paper in 1996 that we can find. So what they do say, though, is that there is a type of feed forward, must have some sort of feed forward. For everything starts at the visual cortex. I think everybody agrees with that. That's where the retinal signal comes in. And then it must get fed forward into some higher level. And it goes through a feed-forward neural network, which kind of filters and structures and figures out what's going on so that you end up with a fully segmented scene right at the top, which you think would be, maybe that's in the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe or something, but it isn't. None of these other areas are showing this differentiation. So this doesn't fit. And also it implies that the neural network has been trained to recognize animals and no animals, but you can do this on totally novel pictures, images. So in our view, what this is saying is that the segmented perceptual scene is immediately available as semantic knowledge to the mind. So what you are seeing, your mind already knows and reflects that in the frontal lobes of your brain. And so we have this picture down here showing that. Our semantic knowledge is already there. And then it proceeds over the next 200 milliseconds, which is Libet's time-on proposal, that it is recognized and comes to conscious awareness. It'll take at least this 350 milliseconds for you to be consciously aware of what you just saw. And so that's what's happening. And that's why we feel that there's this strong connection between semantic knowledge and the frontal lobes. And interestingly, the visual perception arrives as a unity. There was always this question of binding problem. How does the brain unify the visual perception, or any perception? How do you unify your oral perceptions with your visual perceptions? How do you unify all that you see as one thing? Well, if it's coming through the mind, it is unified immediately. And that's what this is showing. And that's what Thorpe's experiment showed. And we infer that this is the mechanism that applies to all semantic knowledge. And of course, it's quickly reflected and comes to consciousness. So now I'd like to examine in more detail what's happening in the frontal lobes of the brain, in particular in the front part called the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex has a number of unusual properties. To begin with, in the human brain, the prefrontal cortex comprises about 20% of the cortical surface. And there's another unusual aspect of this in that the prefrontal cortex is silent to standard electrical stimulation. Usually when you have stimulation of the surface of the cortex with an electrode, there is some sensation that the patient reports. The patient is awake during this procedure, or there's some movement if it's the motor cortex. But when the prefrontal cortex is stimulated, there is no reported sensation or behavior. Another unique part about the prefrontal cortex is that there are unusual cortical granule cells in layer 4 of the prefrontal cortex, but this only occurs in primates, which seems to indicate that these granule cells might be involved with the interface between the mind and the brain. Now, in terms of functional roles in the prefrontal cortex, we mentioned at the very beginning about working memory, which is like a mental sketch pad, so that you can solve arithmetic problems or think through what you're going to do and so on step by step, and that involves the prefrontal cortex. In memory consolidation, there also occurs in prefrontal cortex. A number of studies show that during sleep there is a slow wave deep sleep where the electrical activity is the delta range from 1 to 4 hertz, and this is associated with consolidation of memory. There are also volitional aspects of consciousness involved with the prefrontal cortex, directing attentional focus, and what we call executive functions, which include cognitive control, controlling your thoughts, behavioral control, controlling your behavior within social limits. When there is prefrontal cortex damage or atrophy, dementia, then the behavioral control is lost, and cognitive control is also diminished. Another executive function is planning and making pictures of the future, and also decisions, coming to a decision about something. And then we add to these functions also intuition and thinking, that is, thoughts that seem to come to you out of the blue, and also the conceptual segmentation that we spoke about with respect to the Simon Thorpe's experiments, conceptual segmentation as a part of the process of perception. So in our view, the prefrontal cortex is a significant interface between the mind and the brain, and this has a number of implications. This idea was first outlined by a colleague of ours, Kenny Arnett, in his Theory of Essence that was published in 1999. So in our view, the mental sketchpad is something that is held in the mind and is brought back to consciousness through the prefrontal cortex. So the mind is where the thoughts are held in your sketchpad, but they are brought back to consciousness through the electrical activity of the prefrontal cortex. And the memory consolidation in the slow wave sleep is the process that transforms episodic memories to semantic knowledge that we spoke about at the very beginning. And that also happens through the activity of the prefrontal cortex. But the semantic knowledge is formed and stored in the mind. And the processes of thought and volition involve always 2 steps. First, the mind impresses the thoughts on the prefrontal cortex, while the prefrontal cortex has reduced activity. And this we see in the Simon Thorpe experiments. And the prefrontal cortex begins then to have electrical activity that brings the thought to conscious awareness. So this seems to be a general process. So it's important to consider both the electrical inactivity that is occurring in the brain as well as the electrical activity, the action potentials that are occurring, to understand consciousness. So, getting back to Simon Thorpe's experiment, we see that there is this initial evoked potential at 90 milliseconds. And then that is followed by a large drop in the electrical activity, which we identify as the N100. And then the electrical activity starts to pick up at around 125 milliseconds. And then shortly thereafter, at 150 milliseconds, the first animal to no animal distinction begins to occur in this electrical activity, and this is the P200 part of the EEG pattern. And our interpretation is this. During the N100, the mind impresses the semantic knowledge on the medial prefrontal cortex. And then during the P200, electrical activity in the prefrontal cortex begins to bring this knowledge to consciousness, according to Libet's time-on principle. So now I'd like to make one more point about how the mind works with the brain. And here we're going to consider a different, more recent study of ultra-fast visual categorization. This study was done by Lisandro Kaunitz and colleagues, and is very similar in some respects, but there are differences in how they set this up versus the way Simon Thorpe and his group work. First of all, the presentation was of images of animals and tools versus scrambled images. And the images were presented for 100 milliseconds rather than 20 milliseconds. But they observed similar results, about 95% accuracy for both animals and tools recognized. And of course, the scrambled images were not recognized. And the diagram that's shown here shows over time, for 600 milliseconds, the frontal channels at the top here and the occipital and parietal channels at the bottom. And in this diagram, blue represents negative and red represents positive electrical voltage. And below, also, this shows the location of the electrical activity on the scalp at two particular times, one at around 100 milliseconds and one at 200 milliseconds. So you can see both the time development of the electrical activity across time and also what it looks like in terms of where on the scalp and therefore where in the brain these activities are occurring. And we find there is a similar electrical pattern as was seen with Thorpe. There's a drop in activity in the prefrontal cortex around 100 milliseconds with this blue area, and then there is a large increase in activity at 200 milliseconds. And then also, at the same time, in the parietal and occipital lobes, there is the opposite that is occurring. There is a large activity at first at 100 milliseconds, and that's what you would expect with visual processing going on. And then there is a very large decrease in activity in the next 100 milliseconds, which is something perhaps you wouldn't expect. And then further on, there is further processing throughout the brain, and the image comes to consciousness around 400 milliseconds. So, in our view, in general, the reduction in electrical activity represents the activity of the mind. First, in the prefrontal cortex, the impression of the conceptual or semantic segmentation of the image is impressed on the prefrontal cortex. And then, in the posterior cortex, there seems to be a similar thing that happens. And we speculate that this is the integration or weaving of the semantic knowledge with the visual percept, that is, the details of the visual scene, woven in with the mind in the posterior part of the brain. And that enables the image to come to consciousness and to be accurately recognized. And so periods of inactivity indicate the activity of the mind in the brain. And there is a characteristic oscillatory exchange between the mind and the brain. First, the mind acts on the brain, and there's inactivity in the brain, reduced electrical activity, and then the brain responds with increased electrical activity. And there is this exchange between the mind and the brain of inactivity in the brain and then activity in the brain and vice versa. And this is called a butterfly pattern or a butterfly plot. So now moving on to the problem of how memory works based on these ideas, we have ordinary episodic memories are formed as events are experienced, that we know. And the brain electrical activity occurs in your sense organs, your hearing, your vision, your emotions, and so on, and it activates structures in the hippocampus, and the memories of those activations are transferred to the mind, and then they are recalled from the mind when you want to recall being in trig class in grade 10. And when you recall that, you recall the actual sensory patterns that occurred then, or at least snippets of them, and they reactivate your current sensory structures. And those memories then come to consciousness. And you can smell the coffee at a particular reception where something very significant happens. You can remember that. You can remember the tone of voice that somebody had when they were speaking to you in a particular incident, and so on. So, how does semantic knowledge work? Ordinary semantic knowledge comes through the consolidation of episodic memories through recollection and dreaming. So when you sleep, you dream, and you're kind of rehearsing those memories. And the salient aspects of the events are formed in the mind as facts and details of one's experience. And that's the semantic knowledge that even patient HM could form. And the semantic knowledge resides in the mind and is recalled directly in the brain. And this is where you will sometimes get these intuitions. In fact, this picture is a picture of your intuitions. And we feel that it's probably in the frontal and temporal regions. And if you're recalling semantic knowledge of your experiences, then they will frequently be mixed in with episodic recall of the episodic memories. So you remember, let's see, I was married. When was I married again? And what was the wedding like? And so on. And so now, it's May 17th. Yeah, I remember that. And I was wearing such and such, and this is what it felt like walking down the aisle. So that's some of that semantic knowledge, and some of that is episodic memory. Now, NDE memories are formed directly as semantic knowledge outside the physical body. That's where bringing in NDEs comes in. You have OBE, out of your body percepts. You see things in this realm or in the transphysical realm, and you have direct perception that is imprinted, I guess is the best way to say, in your mind. And it's hyperreal. The perceptions are hyperreal, and the memories are going to be vivid and indelible because of that direct involvement. The memories are not stored as episodic memories and are not recalled through the hippocampus. And we would say that they would be recalled through the semantic knowledge in the frontal lobes, which is what Palmieri and Sessa found in their study, that the frontal lobes have this lower level theta and delta waves when the NDErs, particularly when they're strongly remembering their NDE. And of course, it's then recalled directly in the brain. It's not being stepped down by the hippocampus, it's direct experience again, or more direct, let's say, and that's why it can lead to this altered state of consciousness. So this is an overall picture of memory, our model of memory. Episodic memory, as we said, forms through the hippocampus via sensory experience and is recalled back through by the hippocampus from the mind. Semantic knowledge is formed by consolidation and is recalled through general electrical activity, probably in the frontal lobes. Pattern memory we didn't get to, but it is when you have a pattern of movement or speech or whatever, you will form patterns through the cerebellum as patterns in your mind, which are then brought back. And so now you can, after many years, remember to ride a bike, or you can still remember how to walk, and so on, because that is very deeply formed in your pattern memory. And NDE memories, again, are formed directly in the mind as semantic knowledge when you're separated from the body and are recalled through general electrical activity, probably frontal and temporal lobes, and that's what the evidence shows right now, and they're noted for vividness and intensity. So any theory needs explanatory power, and the better the theory, the more the explanatory power. Well, this model of the mind entity and particularly about memory explains all aspects of NDEs, at least most aspects or almost all aspects of almost all NDEs. In the phenomenology in particular, especially with veridical perceptions and NDE memories. And it answers the enigmas of consciousness. We have a paper here from 2015 that we just got published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, which talks a little bit about that. We have another paper that has not been published yet, but it's on our website. Dealing with the hard problem, how does the brain produce consciousness? Well, it's pretty easy because the brain doesn't produce consciousness. The mind, working with the brain, is conscious. So that's the hard problem. And the binding problem we've just shown you is that the mind gives you the intuition, the knowledge of what you're seeing directly, and ordinary memory as well is explained, the episodic and the pattern memory. And then there are a number of neurological anomalies that this coming to awareness can explain, which is in addition to the speed of sight, which is what we just talked about, split brain phenomena, these are things you probably don't know and I don't have time to explain, but change blindness, blind sight, Libet's antedating paradox and Libet's free will paradox, and others. And we feel that there's some power here for this theory.